Everyone, thank you all so much for joining us. Today's webinar is Responding to the Needs of Children and Families Impacted by Domestic Violence, the sixth webinar of our new series, Building Trauma-Informed Services for Children, Youth, and Parents Impacted by Domestic Violence. Our trainer today will be Susan Blumenfeld, MSW, LCSW, and Child Trauma Training Director for the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Before we get started, I'll go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we will be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained on the Using this WebEx System tab on the upper left-hand side of your screen as well. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether or not you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have any questions regarding the training content. You may contact Jennifer Curley, also with the center, if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You will see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select all participants if you'd like to respond to a question from the trainer or contact me anytime during the session. You should click on Jennifer Curley to privately contact her if you are in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on All Participants, type in the program you are calling from, and then press Enter. Thank you, Amy. Excellent. So you all can continue to do that, and I'll keep giving you some background. So while folks can get a lot of out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel a little bit distracting. If this is true for you, you can feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says Chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We'll be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there is a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes folks find that sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call into the conference line if that's a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Jennifer Curley, you may call WebEx Tech Support to resolve any issues. That phone number is 1-866-229-3239, and this number will be posted in the chat box as well. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and I will now turn the training over to Susan.
Thank you, Erin, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to our sixth webinar in the series. And let's get started. We're pleased to bring this to you as one of the many webinars that we offer through our center, and hope you check us out. And let's get started like we usually do by coming into the present moment and calming and centering with our breath. So if you'd like to join me, we're just going to take a couple of breaths in and out. So on the in-breath, inhale through your nose, and then on the out-breath, release it through your mouth, and if you feel like it, put in an audible ha. So let's try that a couple of times as we come into the present moment. In and out. Deep breath in, all the way clear to your belly, and out. As we usually say when I get started on these, that sometimes there may be material that comes up that is difficult for people to listen to or hear, and we want to be transparent about that. And today we are talking about mental health needs of children and survivors, and including children who have experienced sexual abuse in their lives. So again, I want you to feel free to use your own self-care strategies and awareness, and feel free to doodle, tune out, and I won't mind because I can't see you. So let's get started. Okay. So as I mentioned, today we're going to examine the topic of identifying children's mental health needs, looking at their well-being and thinking about it in the context of their experiences, a range of experiences, including domestic violence, and what resources and supports are available to them. We're also going to look at some behaviors that may be challenging for parents, teachers, caregivers, and other adults involved in children's lives that have experienced domestic violence. And we'll be looking at behaviors such as aggressive behavior. And then we're going to look at the whole process of engaging parents around the process of making mental health referrals for mental health services, and some thoughts on guidelines for matching services and treatment to best fit the needs of each child and family. So we'll begin with our first piece of this. So I think it's very important when we start talking about signs and symptoms in mental health to realize that children's experiences of domestic violence are unique and quite varied. And that for children and for all of us, we may have different needs at different points in time and in our lives. And that healing from the traumatic effects of domestic violence is not a linear process. So for instance, if a child experiences another traumatic event after there's been some safety and comfort in this child's and family's life, it can bring up earlier experiences and can be very imbalancing, destabilizing. Also, when we think about children, when they reach a new developmental milestone or age-related expectations in their lives, that can also bring up past times when they were younger and had other traumatic experiences, and can be challenging in some ways. And then finally, I just wanted to say about this that healing can come from many sources. And one of the main themes that has run throughout this webinar series is the importance of trusting, supportive relationships, both children's attachment relationships with their protective parent and also with others in their lives. And in addition to that, healing comes from being in community with others. And sometimes mental health services can also be useful. So I've talked about this before, that in order to really understand children's behavior, we have to think about it and explore it and be open to understanding the meaning of it in the context of their experiences. So sometimes children's behavior is more situational than anything else. And the example that I've thought about here is the child having difficulty with making the transition to shelter, because there's a lot to get used to and a lot that's been left behind. A lot of difficult things, but also things that a child might miss a lot, like pets and friends and school and the familiarity of home. And some children's temperaments are such that they may have a harder time with new experiences and places and may need a little longer time to feel comfortable and to adjust. So whenever something comes up that may be concerning to the child or parent or to us as advocates or our mental health counselors, we really want to look at that in the context of what's going on currently, and or have these been concerns that have been going on for a while, and finding out a little more about that. So for those of you that have listened to the other webinars, I think this is going to feel very familiar, that part of a main way in which we can be helpful in general is to offer information about the impact of domestic violence in children's lives on their development, on their behavior, and that not only helps to lend understanding to something that might feel confusing to parents, caregivers, and to us, but it helps to normalize and minimize self-blame or for a parent blaming one's children. We've also talked about the importance of key developmental tasks and how trauma may impact children's capacity to master those tasks at different points in their lives, and they have different developmental capacities, and that makes a difference as well in terms of what we might be seeing. I think it's always important to be able to identify the ways in which children have been very resourceful and have used strategies that have really helped ensure their safety and survival in the past within their families, but that those strategies may no longer serve them well, particularly when the family is able to move more towards safety. And then we, parents and advocates and counselors, can be helpful in thinking about more adaptive ways to cope and to heal. So now we're going to look some more at responding to challenging behaviors and concerns. And as I get into this topic, I would just like to invite you to think about some of the children and families that you are working with now. Kind of do a little inventory in your mind and think about what comes to mind for you. And I think that the two questions that we need to ask ourselves that can be very important is who's experiencing the distress and who's holding the concern. That may be more than one person that's experiencing the distress or holding the concern. But to think about that from that perspective, at least that helps me to kind of think about the situation. So for instance, it may be a parent that's upset and concerned about a child's aggressive behavior, let's say towards a younger sibling in the family. Or I'll give you another example, children's advocate that I was providing some consultation to their site was telling me that she was working with a family in shelter, and this was a family with mother and two twin 4-year-olds. And one of the twins was had some developmental delays and was not developing as typically as the other twin. And both, neither were toilet trained. And in that particular instance, the shelter advocate, children's advocate, was concerned. Other kids were making fun of the kids who were still in diapers, and 4 is kind of on that edge. Most kids have started the toilet training process, and many have completed it by 4. It wasn't a concern that the mother had brought to her. So we're going to come back to that and look at it. So just we'll think about this from the perspective of who's experiencing the distress or concern. So next I'm just going to run through a few examples, kind of more developmentally based. So we'll start with young children and things that you might hear or have already heard, I would imagine, from parents or caregivers, or what you've observed. So with young children, my child won't leave my side. Issues around controlling their children's behavior. She's having meltdowns. He's having temper tantrums. They don't listen to me. And then you might also see a child's really struggling to self-soothe when they're upset, and they may not turn to the parent or another adult for comfort. With younger and school-aged children, what you see here on this slide, I think, comes up pretty typically. Children being fearful, having bad dreams, and waking up from them, and having trouble sleeping through the night. Concerns about how children are treating younger siblings, and getting calls from the school if the child's older, maybe preschool on, about getting into fights and not being able to attend. And I think sometimes you'll see or you'll hear from parents that they're concerned that their child seems to kind of blank out at times and they don't know where they're at. They're talking to them and the kid's not there. They're present but not there. So we're going to talk some more about dissociation later on in the webinar. And then the other concerns are really the way in which their children may be behaving towards them, the things they're saying, feeling like they don't have control, and then some concerns about children, who their older kid is hanging out with, drinking, doing drugs, etc. So I think that before we ever think about or consider mental health services, there's so much that we can do as frontline staff and as advocates. And we can begin by engaging and asking parents about their concerns related to their children. So if something gets shared with you, to be able to say, tell me more about it. I'd like to hear more. And really taking the time to be there and to listen and to think together with the parent about what's troubling them and to validate and support them in that process. And then really thinking about, is this more recent? When did you first notice it? So that you're really entering into a more reflective process. And sometimes, as a parent, when we start feeling overwhelmed and concerned, it's really helpful to have another supportive adult there that's able to kind of reflect with us on the situation with our child that's worrying us. So what have you tried, and what's worked in the past? And I think that question is really important because it doesn't assume that as an advocate or a mental health counselor, I'm the one that has the answers. But it's really looking at, we're assuming that parents have resources and have tried things in the past, and sometimes they've worked maybe and sometimes they haven't. And then I think the question about, have you sought support from anyone around this before, can lead into what's happened within the home. And when a protective parent has tried to do something in response to a concern related to their child's behavior, it might be setting limits or something else, have they been undermined in their role by their abusive partner? And so I think this question can help sometimes get to some of that. But it also is a way of finding out who's in this parent's network and who do they go to for support within their broader family, community, however they're defining that. And it also sends a message that, we're there to engage in a collaborative, supportive way with them as well. And if we find out that they've had negative experiences when they've raised this in the past, then we can be sensitive to that. And then the last question, I think, makes a really helpful distinction between what we might do when something happens that bothers us or concerns us or worries us about our child or children, and what we feel like doing. And I think that gets to the difference between how much we can be able to problem solve and think in the moment when something's happening that's bothering us with our children, and how much we can kind of are aware of and can sit on some of our other impulses. When we did the webinar where we talked some more about what happens to our central nervous system and brain development, we talked about Daniel Siegel's brain in the palm of your hand, and he talked about how sometimes when we're really stressed out that we flip our lid, meaning there's a part that in all of us that's kind of what he calls the high road, and that we're called upon all the time to use as parents, that may not be available to us. So we might act rather than thinking about what we should be doing in that situation. So it's a helpful distinction, and I think for some parents, when they can recognize and reflect on the fact that, yes, my impulse was to strike out and I didn't, then we can be really supportive of that and recognize that, and that's very validating. Okay. So the term emotional dysregulation is one that may be familiar to mental health counselors and to advocates, and I just wanted to to define that a little bit, I think emotional dysregulation is one of the hallmarks of what happens when we experience repeated interpersonal violence in our lives. It can happen. And our central nervous system becomes kind of highly sensitized to either taking flight or fighting. And we may have more trouble with self-soothing. And it can take less time for us to get easily upset. So that's what that category is. And the other ones we're going to talk about in more detail. And the first one we have referenced many times in terms of looking at ways in which, and specific ways that parents and advocates can help children to calm down when they are feeling dysregulated. And we'll continue to look at those. And in the next webinar, we're going to look at that some more. Okay, so responding to children's aggressive behavior. I'm imagining that if you've been doing this work for any period of time, that this has been one of the issues that's surfaced, either that you've observed or that parents or caregivers have been troubled by. Often it's not the child that's experiencing the distress in the moment, but those around the child that are. And so when we think particularly about aggressive behavior in the context of experiencing domestic violence, we know that what gets modeled at home, children then learn how they're supposed to be from their caregivers. And if the abusive parent is modeling violence and aggression, then they see that. That becomes part of the atmosphere of what it's like to be in that environment. And sometimes children recognize aggression as a way of getting what you want. And they see what happens in that pattern of control that one partner is establishing over another. And understandably, children don't want to identify with who they're seeing as the weaker person who's getting hurt in many ways. And this, I think a great example of this was in a memoir written by a novelist, Kate Christensen, and she wrote a memoir called The Blue Plate Special, and she's a wonderful writer. And she recalls a time when she was quite young, a very frightening event at the breakfast table in her home, when she saw her father behave quite aggressively and violently towards her mother. And she said she remembers consciously making a decision at that point: I will not be like my mother, I will be like my father. And of course it's more complex than that, because as she got older, that also had an impact on who she was in her life and what she had to defend against within herself. But it's quite typical and understandable that children might identify with the aggression. So there will be times when we're going to need to step in, particularly with young children, or if something's going on that's really potentially quite dangerous. We're going to have to stop the behavior and ensure safety. And whenever possible, we would want to bring in the parent and have the parent act. But I know there are a number of us that have been in situations where a child was about to run into the street and dropped our hands, or dropped the parent's hand, and there was oncoming traffic, and we didn't see the parent immediately respond in that moment. So there will be situations like that. And then I think it's always important then to be able to process that with the parent, and or if they're not acting, to ask permission. Can I help your child off the ledge? It looks like they might be climbing in a dangerous place right now. And to let parents know that we don't want to take over their role. We want to be there to support them. And to the third dot point on here, that it's really important then, because sometimes, understandably, parents are going to get very activated when their child is acting aggressively. And so it's helpful if we're there while this is happening to help everyone to cool down, and then to have some space when people can actually attend to listen to from everybody's viewpoint what was going on and what happened. So safety first, right? And being able to validate that a child or a parent was feeling angry or overwhelmed or upset, but that basically it's not okay to hit, kick, throw, because that can hurt people. And I know for a period of time, sometimes, phrases are just more kind of in the popular lexicon or something, for lack of a better way to describe this. And I know I was in many places and probably guilty of this myself in different settings during my career, where found myself or others saying to children, that's inappropriate, or that is absolutely unacceptable behavior. And we're hoping that we can be self-aware enough that we can catch ourselves, because I think when we see children acting aggressively, or we ourselves can get activated and can feel more vulnerable or worried. And that's when I think kind of we have these more automatic reactions and we can find ourselves being judgmental. And I was, just as an aside, I was doing a play therapy session with a 5-year-old who had experienced domestic violence in the home, and this was post-separation, and she had regular visitation with her father on the weekends, and she was enacting a play scene with a little girl doll and a daddy doll, and all of a sudden she had the daddy doll say, "That is inappropriate." And so I said to her, "Wow, that's a big girl. That's a big word. Does the little girl doll know what that means?" And she looked at me and said, "Yes, it means she is being bad." So when we use words like that, I think what happens is that the tone of our voice and the word, whether or not it's understood, the message that gets across is, you're not okay. So we want to try to avoid that when we can. And if we can't, then to undo it, because we always have opportunities to redo things and to repair. So particularly in families where there has been a pattern of violence and the survivor has done his or her best to protect their children, and the violence is going on, that it can be very difficult to start to unlearn some of the things that got learned about hitting. And because from a child's perspective, if an adult's doing something, then it's okay and it's permissible. So really being there to support parents and to help them problem solve with their children about other ways to express their feelings rather than acting, and to find some other things that they can do and other ways of working things out. So, if it's a little girl or a little boy, again, we want a developmentally sensitive response to be able to say, you're just little and you haven't learned yet that hitting and kicking can hurt people. And your mom, or if it's a protective parent, is trying to teach you that. And you can't kick because it hurts. And as children get older, to talk more about what it means to be mad and how to use your words when you're mad after you can cool down. And also, I think it's really helpful to say to children, when you feel mad or sad, who can help you? Who can you go to? So that children have the experience of a protective parent or other adult if it's in a shelter-based setting, in addition to the parent, who can be there to help them through some of those feelings. Because we know that if children have experienced repeated violence in their lives, that they are going to get upset more easily, and they're going to go from 0 to 100. And so we can help them understand that too. And I think that helps them feel more okay, and it moves away from that sense of being bad or feeling bad. Okay. And I just, to go back 1 minute, I didn't say much about adolescents. I think with adolescents, when there have been flare-ups, I think it's helpful then sometimes to have somebody other than the parent, if there's another adult around, to be able to say, okay, after people have cooled down, let's figure out and let's talk together about what happened and what was going on, because the older the child is, the more we hope they're going to have the capacity to do problem solving and to think more about what sets them off and what they might do to avoid the situation in the future. Okay. So the next behavior that can be very activating, not only for parents but also for advocates and counselors, is when we see sexualized behavior in children. And you may see that if you're working in a shelter setting. You may get reports from daycare settings or from schools about this, and it's troubling. And certainly, if we think about this in the context of children who have experienced domestic violence, then they may have seen their one parent being sexually assaulted, and that's been frightening. And/or we may find that children have been exposed to pornography, adult nudity, or adult sexuality. So in the beginning, it's helpful for us to know that it might be activating for us, and depending on what our own personal history is, to be aware of all of that and what might come up for us, and wherever possible, for us to be calm and to be able to step back from it. And then the next piece of this is to think developmentally. So we know that young children naturally are curious about their own body and others' bodies. And as kids get older, and even at a certain age of 3 or more, kids may masturbate more openly. As they get older, if they're doing that, then it may be a way to self-soothe, but it's going to be jarring and feel intrusive to others around them. And they may need help with thinking about boundaries and privacy, etc. The third piece of this is to stop any behavior between peers, so children of the same age, that seems coercive or intrusive, and to be able to intervene and to understand what's going on. Because generally in those situations, in my experience over the years as a clinician, a mental health clinician, that for those children where one is intrusive or acting coercively towards another, that it's what we would call sexually reactive behavior, and generally that's a red flag or a signal that perhaps this child has been sexually abused and may be currently being sexually abused. And so we want to be able to intervene, and as mandated reporters to be able to report that and to hopefully get help for everybody. Now this, I think, really takes on another level of complexity when we're thinking about adult survivors and their children, since sexual assault can be such a kind of major component of what's going on in terms of coercive control. And we also know that unfortunately risk increases for children and families where domestic violence occurs. Risk increases in terms of also experiencing physical abuse and also experiencing sexual abuse. So protective parents may be fearful, and rightfully so, that if something like this happens, that maybe their child is being sexually abused and they weren't aware of this before. So it's going to be helpful to really provide a lot of support about this. If it's something that's developmentally based, to be able to provide reassurance. But one way or the other, to be able to talk it through and to understand it, and also from a cultural and parenting practice lens to understand what this behavior may mean for this particular parent at this point in time. So this is a big topic, and we're only touching on it today. Okay. So the next thing that you probably have encountered with children and families that you're working with and supporting is children who internalize their feelings. So these are kids who seem sad a lot, withdrawn at times socially, or very anxious, and they may feel alone with those feelings and in a way unseen, if that makes sense, by others. So it can be very helpful to, and what I like to do is a kind of wonder aloud. I certainly wouldn't name for a child that they're feeling sad, but I'd say, I wonder if when I see your expression on your face now, if you might be feeling sad about something that's going on or something that you're thinking about. Or nervous about something. And to reassure children that when they've had some of the experiences that children have had who have experienced domestic violence, that it's pretty common for kids to feel that way. And then I've often found that with that sort of permission, it really helps children, and they can open up quite readily. Some children do. And talk about what's going on, and then we're just there to be present with them and not offer any solutions, but really to be able to hear them, and hopefully to bring in the protective parent to recognize and support it. And often I've had survivors talk to me about the fact that they're worried about their child's anxiety and sadness, and they see it. And so it's really looking at how can we think about ways to help your child. So that they can understand that when you're scared about something, that these feelings are normal, and to figure out some ways to help them express it. So play, drawing, art, they're all really helpful ways to deal with that. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is that sometimes children dissociate. So what do I mean by that term? Most of us may be familiar with this, but if not, let me just go over it. So dissociation in and of itself is something that all of us do. We can daydream, and if we're doing something that's more rote or routine, we kind of are in a daydream or dissociative type state. So, I mean, I think a great example that I know has happened to me is I'm driving in my car and I'm thinking about something really intensely, or I'm somewhere else, but somehow I look up. I mean, hopefully I've been looking on the road, of course, as I'm driving, but I look up and I see, oh, I'm already at the grocery store. So I think that's a form of dissociation, right? So we're doing something in a rote way or routine way, or we're daydreaming. Some of you may be daydreaming now in the midst of the webinar. So, but when we're talking about dissociation and recognizing and responding to that in children, the child spaces out or doesn't seem connected in the room, in the present. And I worked for a number of years in a child psychiatry clinic, and we saw all kinds of kids and all sorts of issues, and I remember learning then that there are children who do kind of momentarily space out, and actually they have a medical condition. They might have petit mal seizures. So I don't want to assume that if a child seems to space out on a regular basis that they're dissociating. They may have a medical condition. So I just want to put that caveat in there because I think that's really important. And so, but if a child has experienced more severe chronic domestic violence in their caregiving environment, and they may have also at the same time experienced abuse of some sort, then we might see children really doing what kids have told me. They say, I just go away in my mind. I'm no longer there. And they may not be aware that they're going away, but it's protective. You know, it's actually a helpful resource. But it's concerning when children might get in situations that are endangering, or if they lose time or lose connection. So we want to be able to normalize the response, but at the same time be able to take it seriously. So depending on the circumstance, if this happens and you see that a child's dissociating and the parent's not in the room, that what I think is helpful is to gently call the child by name and see if they can respond to you once or twice. And if you don't get a response, you can start to verbalize. This is what I found helpful, to say, I think something may have scared you. I'm here with you now. And if you still don't get a response, then I might say, again, you know, if I don't know the child very well and I don't know what their experiences are, I want to be very careful about this next step. But I may say, is it okay if I put my hand on your shoulder right now, or your hand, so that I can help you be not so scared? But we always want to offer choice, and we want to see what happens if we offer that and the child still seems to be elsewhere and not in the present space. And we can say, can you hear what I'm saying? And I think in those situations that part of what comes through is the tone of our voice, the cadence of how we're talking, our posture, how soothing and reassuring we are, and our patience of being there for the child and wanting to help. And then when the child comes more to the present again, saying, I wonder if you were thinking about or heard something or saw something that reminded you of something scary. And maybe you were just back in the middle of that again, and you lost track of being here in the room with me. Do you know where we are now? What would help you feel safe right now? And often if children aren't with their parent or caregiver at that point, they may say, you know, I want to go be with my parent. And then I think we want to figure out a way to involve the parent or caregiver with the child. Think about that, what we're going to say and do. Invite the child in a collaborative way if they're able to participate with you at this point. If they're a young child, then I would go and get the child and not have a lot of language around this. And then talk with the parent about it and explain what happened. And sometimes parents are aware of this process with their children. I think of something that occurred when I was working at a domestic violence shelter and doing some consultation there. And a parent told me that her 5-year-old was playing a game of hide and seek and closed her eyes because she was counting to 20. And all of a sudden, she saw that her child started shaking on the ground and crying, and she went up to her and reassured her and was there to be with her. And what we later were able to kind of piece together was that not only had the child started to dissociate, I think because she closed her eyes. I don't know that there was anything going on in the present environment, but she started to remember and feel as if she was right back in a very, very scary incident that had happened in her home between her mother and her father. So that's another example. And I know that when I've talked with advocates and mental health clinicians around the country that many of you have had experience with this. And it's helpful, you know, to be able to think this through and to be prepared to respond. Okay, so what we're going to talk about next is looking at ways to help children and survivors as well to get centered and grounded if they start to dissociate, and or if they're at a point where they have thoughts racing through their mind that's very painful, that they can't stop, and they can't feel. They may have sensations in their bodies. It may be emotional, it may be physical, and it really things get so interiorized that it's easy to lose track of what's going on, and you're finding yourself really not connected to where you are in the present moment. So I like the work of Lisa Najavitz, who wrote a wonderful manual called Seeking Safety that she wrote for mental health clinicians who were working with adult survivors of trauma and survivors who also had issues with substance use. So one of the first things to do is thinking about something that parents do all the time with young children, and that's called distraction. So how can we distract ourselves from those things that become overwhelming to us emotionally, that are going on and that are painful, scary, overwhelming. And sometimes we have, as we just were talking about, we've got automatic ways of dealing with that when our bodies and minds protect us through dissociation. But sometimes we can't get those racing thoughts and sensations and feelings to stop. And it's very distressing. It's distressing to children, and it's distressing to adults. So there are three forms of this. One is mental grounding, and that's where you focus your mind on other things other than that interior dialogue. So it's noticing things in the outside world. So it's sometimes very helpful to look outside and describe to yourself, I'm looking out the window now of my office and looking at the tall buildings that are here in Chicago and looking at the number of windows and how many floors. So again, it's a way of focusing mental attention. I guess I'd prefer to be looking at trees and sunlight, but again, whatever is available to you. I could look around my office as well. So that's mental grounding. Then the second kind of grounding is physical grounding, where we're really trying to focus back in the present moment through our senses. So you can do this with children. I know I have done this, and I've done this with adult survivors that I've been working with as well, to say, can you feel your feet on the floor? How does it feel to sit in your chair? Sometimes it's helpful to just get up and walk around and move. To carry an object with you that can be, that feels good and safe. I love holding rocks myself and stones, and I always have a small pebble that I carry with me in a pocket or in my purse, and it's just something that makes me feel grounded. And the third way is soothing. It can be remembering a safe place and going there in your mind and really getting back into it. It can also be talking to yourself in a way that's kind and compassionate. And in one of our prior webinars, we did a self-compassion break or exercise that was developed by Kristen Neff. And so one of the things that we can say to ourselves if we've got things, just sensations racing, thoughts that are really overwhelming to us, is this is suffering. Or we might have being kind to ourselves. I'm going through a really tough time right now, but I can get through this. So those are examples. And what we're going to do next is try one of the grounding with our senses, one of the physical ways to ground. So if you want to join me with this, I would invite you to. And so look around you, feel your feet on the floor, sit in your chair, feel yourself present here now where you are, and think to yourself about 5 things that you can see in your environment right now. And 4 things you can touch. 3 things you can hear. 2 things you can smell. And 1 thing you can taste. And a number of programs across the country actually are using this, have used it, and some programs have taken this, these 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 and made them into laminated cards. So little, you know, like small, like business cards that they've laminated with symbols of each sense that are on there. And adults can carry them with them when they're going to work, or if they're in, you know, if they realize that I get frightened when I'm in a particular place, and I can pull out, I have my card. It's like carrying a stone with you, right? It's a physical object that can ground you and that you can look at too, and that can bring you back to the present moment. And for children, it's really helpful because when they go on visits with the non-custodial parent, when they're going to school, it can be something that they can do without others noticing, but it's something that can help, that's grounding and that's soothing, and that can really help. Okay, so we're going to pause now to see if you want to reflect on what we've covered so far and to comment and ask some questions. Okay. Jen has just handed me a question. So what alternatives would you, oh great, okay, so this is a wonderful question because we do so often use the words inappropriate or unacceptable. So what alternatives would you suggest? So I think what I would do in the moment is to get more descriptive about the behavior. And like I said before, if it's a little child saying, you're feeling mad right now, and you crumpled up Johnny's paper, and then Johnny got sad and mad and he hit you. So it's really more talking about what's going on rather than saying, hitting is unacceptable, we will not do that, because then Johnny and the child that's crumpled up the paper end up getting that message of, I'm bad, there's something wrong with me, I'm out of control. So it's more helpful, I think, to be able to talk about what happened, have a little time to process it, help kids to, another thing that I think helps is to say, can you tell me what you're feeling in your body right now? If a child is angry or doing, you know, once you've sort of stopped whatever the behavior is, and let them know that that hurt. Johnny, when you hit Sally, that hurt. That hurt Sally. And to talk about it that way. Okay. So I hope, and I think some of it is just being more aware ourselves when we start to get activated and we use these words that really carry judgment with us. And so to have a moment ourselves to calm down as we're trying to help calm down the situation, and so to to have that little pause in there for ourselves before, and so we can listen to what's coming out of our own mouths. Because what we're really trying to do is to, first of all, normalize the fact that it is okay to be mad, to be sad, to have a range of feelings. Feelings are okay, but our actions that might hurt people's feelings or their bodies are harmful. So I hope that answers the question that the participant had. And there's another one that I'm seeing in the chat right now. So what kind of environment have you discovered that helps calm a person who has experienced trauma, and do you have any resources or studies to recommend? Okay. So that's a very wonderful question. Thank you, Matt. And a very broad-based question as well. So if we think about a trauma-informed environment, part of what helps children and adults to calm down is when we're aware of what their behavior may be conveying in terms of what their past experiences have been and how those experiences might be coming up for them in the present. So some of it's an understanding, being able to convey that, and then asking people what's helpful to them when they're, again, the older the child or the older, with older children it's easier to have those kinds of conversations, but to really figure out with them what helps. It might help when my mom or my dad or who the protective parent is can just hold me when I'm feeling like this, can just be with me and not say anything. Or it might help, I like it when we play a certain song. Or I feel better if I can go and do something, play a game on the computer right now. That's going to help me calm down. And as I talked about when we looked at what happens in our central nervous system and the brain, that if a child's feeling really activated, to have a problem-solving discussion, even to ask questions like that, is not going to be really helpful. So it's more in what we're conveying, not only through the physical environment, but through the relational environment. And I think it was in the last webinar, or it was the webinar about building trauma-informed, family-centered services, that I referenced a tool that our center has developed called the ACDVTI tool, and Jen can get you that reference, that really looks at environment and what helps. The other thing has to do with how we're feeling. I mean, in response to that question, I remember a number of years ago when I was working in a large community-based social service agency as a mental health clinician. We had different programs, and we had some programs that did more prevention and school-based work, and we had a program that did more family service-based, what we called family service-based work. And they had, I think that this boy was maybe 12 or 13, and he was scaring everybody, basically. He was cursing, he was flailing out with his arms. And they came to get me as the mental health person, saying, we want to hospitalize him. This kid's been like this before, and he's out of control. And so I remember this so clearly because I walked in there and I wasn't afraid of him. And others in the room, he was picking up that sort of emotion that was in the room, which was understandable because this family service worker didn't have the same training or confidence in that. And so I just sat with him, and I didn't say anything. I just sat, I got down, he was on the floor, I think, at one point, and I talked to him then in a pretty soothing voice. So, it was what I said before about the tone of our voice, our posture, and I think what I conveyed to him was that I had a sense that he was really activated right now, but that we were going to be there to help him. And actually, he did calm down to a point where we didn't need to do anything more intensive at that point. So I hope that, and I think I've lost the second part of the question, which was, let's see. And do you have any resources or studies to recommend? So I think the tool is really helpful, and I'll have to think about other resources that might be helpful. But thank you for asking that question. And we have one. I'll take one more question, and then we're going to move on. So there's some questions that really have to do with boundaries in children. The first one is about, both from Ashley, the first one about teaching children about privacy in a way, small children, that doesn't make them feel ashamed. That is a fabulous question, Ashley. Thank you for asking that. And so my feeling about this is that we don't teach that before we're able to establish some kind of sense of safety, right, for the child. Because if, in fact, the child's behavior is sexually reactive and we start talking about boundaries and privacy, they may then interpret that as children do with older children and adults if they're victimized, as being responsible and ashamed for the behavior. So that's a small piece. I know in this webinar series we're not going to be going into more depth about this, but if people are interested in getting more on this, it's something that we might consider for future webinars. And then Ashley also asked, what's the best way to respond to children disclosing past aggressive behavior that they feel ashamed about? Also an absolutely fabulous question. And I think if a child trusts you enough to be able to tell you about that, then I think you've already done something right. Because for any of us, it's hard to disclose things that we're ashamed about. And we need that level of trust and safety in a relationship to be able to talk about those things. And then what I do when kids disclose things like that, it may be aggressive behavior, it may be something else that they're ashamed about, is to really, first of all, be able to normalize it, to explore it with them a little bit, to be able to normalize it, and to go from there. We're going to talk some about trauma-specific treatment interventions, which can be helpful for some kids as well. So at this point, I'm going to move along. Thank you so much for those questions. They were great. So the next section, we're going to talk about engaging parents. When we're looking at or they're asking about mental health services for their children. So again, I think it's so important to look at who's identifying the concern, who's having the distress, and if it's the advocate or another adult that's involved, to really begin to engage in a conversation with the parent when you feel like there's enough rapport there, and or depending on the urgency of what you've noticed, and to say, you know, I've seen this with your child or your older child or teen, and have you noticed it? Have you seen this? And to see whether or not it might be something that they are concerned about, but no one's asked them about, and there's been so much else that's been overwhelming that they haven't talked about it. So I think that can be helpful. In the situation that I mentioned earlier about the mother who was living in shelter with her twin 4-year-olds, as the children's advocate started to explore this with her, it was really complex because on the one hand, she really did and recognized that at 4 she should begin to do the process of toilet training. She also was feeling really tapped out and overwhelmed by all that she had been through recently. And, you know, it takes a lot of effort to parent one child, let alone twins. And she also had a child with special needs. One of the twins had special needs. So some of it was, you know, in the midst of everything going on in her life, it was a lot to start to tackle toilet training. Some kids go to it more readily. Her children did not. And so once she and the children's advocate started to explore this in ways that they might get into this, she was very receptive and appreciated having the support and thinking through what might work for each of her children because they were different. And she was also able to say that, you know, sometimes it was real. She felt so guilty about what they had seen or been through that sometimes it was hard for her to set limits, because for a lot of children, toilet training is, you know, not the most fun thing in the world. So that's one example. There may be times where, as an advocate, you're seeing things that concern you that the parent's just not seeing, and you point it out, and you're finding that you're just not quite on the same wavelength. And so I think in those situations, without some kind of alliance, you can sort of agree to disagree and to come back to it at another time, and just to have put it out there and see what the response is at a later time. Again, depending on the urgency. So I think from the parent's perspective, and I know this, I've found this to be true for myself as a parent at times, that we have these unspoken questions or concerns. Is my child okay, and am I a good parent or a good enough parent? And those unspoken questions can get really amped up when the idea of seeking help outside of the family or a support network is raised, particularly if it's raised by someone other than ourselves. But even if we're considering it ourselves, it's a tender time. You can feel very vulnerable. So along those lines, what might be happening for the parent if we begin to talk about this? So it can be particularly evocative if there's been domestic violence in a pattern of coercive control, because we know so often the protective parent feels ashamed and gets blamed for what they're doing or not doing, and told that they're a terrible parent. And then that becomes part of the dynamic in the family. And so if we're raising a concern and talking about mental health services, it may just feel like, and this may not get voiced, but it may be there, so what he or she was saying about me is really true, and somebody else thinks that too. So we also know that sometimes the child's or parent's mental health can be used as a coercive tactic in an ongoing court case by the abusive partner. And I just wanted to bring your attention to two resources that our center has developed that might be interesting to you if you want to explore this a little more fully. One is really a tip sheet for advocates and legal advocates to support survivors in contested custody cases, and the other really reflects the voices and wisdom of survivors who have talked through the DV helpline, the national helpline, about how mental health or substance abuse has been used against them. So again, as we're thinking about services, mental health may be a very loaded topic. And in addition to that, this takes on complexity when we're thinking about engaging parents, because we want to be aware of cultural beliefs and practices related to wellness and mental health and services in general. So how is it viewed or seen? I know I worked with many families, and a family comes to mind of an immigrant and her family, and she shared with me that in her country of origin, that if somebody was considering mental health services, they were psychotic, they were crazy, they would have to be hospitalized. And so some of it may be a matter of really exploring what we mean by it, and also just being open and respectful to what's helpful to people and what's going to create wellness and health for this particular child and family. And then the second piece of that, looking at whether or not, in the first example, mental health services in general, and in this person's country of origin, were stigmatizing. But I think that in our mainstream culture in the United States, that mental health services may be viewed as stigmatizing and labeling deficits and not helpful. And so to be conscious of what prior experiences may have been for parents when we're engaging them to talk about this, and whether or not experiences with oppression and racism and discrimination also shape how they're thinking about what we're recommending or thinking about with them in terms of mental health services. Okay. So I want us to think about this for a minute in terms of particularly babies and young children and their well-being and, if you will, their mental health being linked to how well their primary caregivers or others in their lives are doing. Because we know babies and young children are so dependent on their caregivers. And we've talked about how secure attachment relationships provide a foundation for our unfolding development and our well-being. So babies and young children are learning through their interactions with others, and they're sensitive to the moment-by-moment needs and moods of their caregivers. And so if they have a number of frightening experiences in a caregiving environment where there's domestic violence, then they're going to be sensitized to that, and that's going to affect their well-being or may affect their well-being depending on what other resources are there. So the protective parent may be there to really buffer against those other frightening experiences. And then sometimes the protective parent herself or himself may be depressed or checked out or numbed or really doing the best they can to make it through and being very concerned about their children, but perhaps not being able to consistently tune in, particularly if they're under assault themselves. And I've found in some of the work that I've done with young children and their mothers is that when I can point out the ways in which a child's whole face and demeanor lights up when the mother smiles at the child, that sometimes survivors recognize in ways that they didn't when they were under siege how important they are in the lives of their babies and young children. If they had been told and had all those messages that they internalized about how awful they were and how unimportant they were. So in that regard, sometimes it can be really helpful to seek services that are for parents and children together, mental health services. And certainly my belief, and others would support me on this, feel that the treatment of choice for parents with young children under age 6 is to see the parent and child together. And sometimes that may be too evocative for a parent if there are things that a young child might be playing out. And so you've got to be flexible around that. And so it might be that you have a mental health therapist who's doing some play sessions with a child, but is also involving the parent in one-on-one supportive sessions and talking about what's going on. Because in a way, it's one layer or level removed, and it might be easier to take in. So it's helpful to seek services when parents and children end up having misperceptions about each other as dangerous or unsafe or unprotective, and that those experiences and misperceptions grow out of experiencing the traumatic experiences with domestic violence or something else. And then the other criteria that's helpful to think about is if we're seeing and if the parent begins to recognize that they're really disconnected from their baby. It's not that uncommon when survivors experience a lot of severe and chronic trauma or are touched by what's going on currently, depending on what the pattern of domestic violence is, to really get numbed out, because that is a way of protecting themselves. But if you're numbed out and you have a baby or a very young child, then you can't be there for them to provide what they need optimally, right? And I do think, though, that for so many families, it's not, and I don't want to get into, I want to be really careful not to blame the victimized parent in all of this and to say, oh, well, it's up to that parent then to provide everything for the child in the moment. We also have to provide supports for that parent if they're really numbed out and having a hard time, and to help them then in other ways, not just through parent-child work, and to support them, and also to look at what other resources there. For so many families, there are other caregiving adults within the family system who are safe and protective that can help in that situation. Okay, so other factors to consider when making a mental health referral for a child and when we're talking to parents about this. And I think we've covered some of this before when we've looked at trauma-related responses. Again, it's understanding a child's behavior and responses in relation to their experiences. So when it gets in the way of their functioning, often you hear children's sleep is really disrupted, and then they don't have any energy to play or attend in school the next day, and they may be more irritable and angry. So it's getting in the way of day-to-day stuff. And then you might see, not as commonly, but you might see children that engage in what we call post-traumatic play. And so that's play that's repetitive, and a child is recreating an aspect of a traumatic experience that's been overwhelming, and it doesn't lead to mastery. And in fact, the child might become more anxious. And if you've ever been in the presence of a child who's doing post-traumatic play over and over again, it's got this relentless, disconnected quality to it. So the child it's really a form of dissociation. The child's in their own world while they're doing this. It's not play that allows the child to work through what's gone on or to integrate their experiences. And so in those situations, it's helpful to bring, just as we talked about the grounding, to bring the child back into the present moment, into the room. And then the other piece is children that engage in self-harming behavior, which is so difficult for us to see and witness as advocates, as mental health clinicians, as parents and caregivers, and other caring adults. And so we're seeing children that might bite themselves, scratch, cut, pull out their hair. And I think a form of this, as we might see with teenagers, is they might be engaging in behaviors because they've got more mobility that are self-endangering to themselves and to others, like driving recklessly while they're drinking or doing other things. And again, if we see children who seem to be dissociating a lot and losing track of time and place, and they don't have a medical condition that would explain it, but we understand it in the context of their experiences. Okay. So sometimes children may mirror or give expression to what a primary caregiver or other family member may be feeling, and this can include depression, anxiety, fear, or suicidal thoughts. And I'll give you an intense type example, but one that comes to mind from a little boy and mother that I worked with, where there was a past history of domestic violence. Currently, this mother and son were living in a transitional housing setup, and the mother had had a lot of separations from her son throughout his young life. She had been in jail a couple of times, and he had a primary caregiver who was who he loved, who was very stabilizing to him, as his aunt. And at one point, his aunt made a suicide attempt. And she was okay at that time, but at the time that I was working with this mom and her little boy, but we realized in working together that he kept saying things like, "I'm going to kill myself." And when he said that, what we were able to link was, it was at times when his mother was feeling particularly overwhelmed. And I think that what happened was that he was very tuned in a kind of hypersensitive way to what his mom's mood was, and it reminded him of what was going on with his aunt, and he didn't want to lose his mother. So that's a dramatic example, but it happens, and I'm sure that there are others that you can think about that have come up. So sometimes when children express anxiety or fear or depression, it may be because they're also holding feelings for another family member. But they also may be feeling those feelings themselves. So I don't want to say it's either or. Okay. So again, with all the caveats we talked about in terms of engaging in the subject of mental health services, if this isn't something that a survivor is thinking about herself or himself, when might it be helpful? So you'll see the first dot point is very similar to what we were talking about with children. And the first several dot points, really. And I think one of the things that's really important is to validate what the survivor has done to cope in the past and how that has been really life-saving and helpful, but may no longer serve them in the way that they wanted to move on in a different way in their lives if they're currently safe. So I would say, you know, the kind of takeaway from this is go slow pace, give information when it's welcome, explore what might be helpful. I remember working with a survivor who was had been in shelter for a couple of weeks, and she said that her advocate had told her that she was making a referral for her to see a psychiatrist for PTSD. And I looked at the survivor's body language, and I said, so what do you think about that? And she said, well, it's something I've got to do. And she said, you know, they're sending me to a psychiatrist. They think I'm crazy. So I think it's very helpful to sort of unpack what those expectations are and to make sure that people have choice, that you can explore it, they can ask more questions about it, they can try it out. We can, and really in that situation I said, you know, it might be helpful for you and the advocate and I to talk about this a little more and to understand more what she was thinking when she said that to you, if you're interested in that. And then I talked a little bit about what PTSD, what post-traumatic stress disorder was about, and we explored that a little bit in terms of what the survivor was experiencing in the moment. Okay, so the final part about this is looking at guidelines for matching services and treatment to the individual child and family, and what their concerns are and what they want, and what might be helpful. Big first step, building those collaborative relationships. We all know how scarce and inadequate those resources can be, but it is so helpful to have those relationships in place when we have somebody who is ready and interested in seeking mental health services, to have those in place, and to also have a range of community organizations that we can turn to help as well. So for me, these would be the considerations. Often we know that, and again, this is where relationships are so important. Has there been cross-training? Do the mental health providers, do they get it in terms of being DV informed? Do they take a collaborative approach? Because if you have a provider that's not thinking about working collaboratively, then they're really not very trauma informed. If we're talking about working with children, if they're under 6, I hope they're considering doing parent-child together, because as I said before, with certain exceptions, that's really the way to go. Or if they're doing one-on-one work with a child, is it inclusive of the protective parent? So we want to know those things. What kind of experience have they had? So again, rather than interrogating people who've got a relationship, right, you can begin to find out What do they do? If they're a private practitioner, what do they do? If they work with an agency, because again, we know for so many of the families that we serve, they may not have adequate resources, insurance to cover, if we find those services, to cover them, right? But so to find out what they do. And then to be familiar enough that we know we can help talk with the parent in advance about what they can expect and what their children can expect from the process. And then the final point is that there are many ways of moving towards safety and resilience and healing, and that mental health services alone are never sufficient, in my opinion, and that if you've got a mental health provider that's putting together a treatment plan for services with a family, that hopefully they are thinking holistically and they're looking at other community-based services and supports. So this is just a little bit about, we're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes, but here are the trauma treatment type approaches. So it can be individual, parent-child, family, group. There are many ways to incorporate play, talk, expressive arts. And for some children, they're not going to have specific memories, and I'm thinking about older children, about what went on. And same is true for adults. And their mind-body-centered approaches can be very helpful. I think about a mother and her 13-year-old son who came to our program when I was working in a social service agency, and she was very concerned about his behavior. He was aggressive, he was failing in school, he was scaring her in terms of how he was relating to her. And he was now, as a 13-year-old, looked very much like how his father had looked. At age 5, she told me that he witnessed, and again, this is going to be intense information, but he witnessed his father's attempted murder of her, and then he killed himself. And this was in front of this 5-year-old boy who is now 13. And he had no recollection of what happened. And people were saying, you know, he's got to go to therapy so that he can remember what happened to him, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, that kind of approach, I think, for survivors is really, excuse the expression, crazy making, because we don't always have memories. And so some of the body-based approaches can be really helpful in finding ways to cope. And you don't always have to remember everything that happened to lead a good life and to go on in your life and to feel whole again. So there's not enough research and there's not enough going on in terms of culturally specific trauma-informed work, but we know that there are promising practices that are bubbling up everywhere, and they're so helpful and important. And we have to think about those approaches in relation to when we're thinking about mental health trauma treatment. And then there are evidence-supported treatment approaches. Two of them that I think are the most well-known and have the most sort of research base behind them and people trained, mental health clinicians trained in them, are child-parent psychotherapy and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. I feel the first is really great for parents and young children, and the second I think works best if children are cognitively at about that 6-year-old level or older. Part of what I love about trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is that it involves the protective parent or caregiver. This could be a whole seminar in and of itself, but what I wanted to point out about this slide is that you'll notice that the core components of trauma treatment approaches are the same as trauma-informed services that we've been talking about through this series. If you want to learn more about these, here are some websites I'd ask that you can check out. And we have a few minutes left. I don't know if there is one more question or if we want to wrap up, given where we are with the time. Next month, we are going to be revisiting the trauma-informed, resiliency-based framework approach that I talked about in the first webinar. That the acronym is SAS, and it stands for Safety, Attachment, Self-Regulation, and Self-Esteem. And so I hope you can join us for that. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Susan. I would like to thank Susan Blumenfeld for such an exceptional webinar. Thank you to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Jen Curley for making the webinar run so smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all for spending your time with the center. Within the next week, I will send you all a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar, in addition to the slides and handouts, and also the references that Susan was talking about, most of which will be available on our website. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you all again, and we hope you all have a fantastic afternoon. Take care.